This was my 2019 Honda CRF450L that I purchased almost brand new with just 300 miles back in July of 2022. Fast forward to today, that same bike now has over 540 hours, well over 20,000 miles, thousands of dollars worth of modifications, countless road trips, supermoto rides, enduro rides, wheelies, crashes, and just about everything you can throw at a bike. The interesting thing is, before this bike, I didn't even ride dirt bikes. I started riding back in 2017, and like a lot of beginner riders, I was completely obsessed with sport bikes, MotoGP, track style riding, and anything that involved just going fast. For years, that's pretty much all I wanted to do. But eventually, I found myself getting bored. I felt like I wasn't really progressing as a rider anymore. Every ride started feeling the same, and I was just getting tired of chasing speed and dealing with all the risks that came with that. It got to the point where I actually stopped riding altogether and took nearly a year off riding bikes. And at this point, I honestly thought I was done riding. Then, during that year away from bikes, I started spending more time on YouTube, and that's when I stumbled across the Swedish supermoto scene. I started watching videos from groups like the Backpack Wheelie Boys, countless other European supermoto creators. The riding style was completely different from anything I've ever seen before. I kind of fell in love with wheeling through city streets and hitting urban jumps and riding stair sets. Before I knew it, I developed a complete obsession with supermotos and the European wheelie scene. The more videos I watched, the deeper down the rabbit hole I went. That eventually led me to discover hard enduro events like the Erzberg Rodeo, and an entire side of motorcycling that I never really knew existed. For the first time, riding looked less about top speed and more about bike control, skill, and just having fun on any terrain. The more I watched, the more I realized there was an entire world of riding I had never really experienced. But what's funny is, I actually didn't set out to buy a CRF450L in the first place. In fact, I barely knew anything about dual sports, dirt bikes, or supermotos at the time. After taking nearly a year off of riding, I knew I wanted to get back on two wheels, but I really wasn't sure what I wanted. So I started scrolling through Facebook Marketplace just looking for anything that seemed interesting. At the time, used dual sports in my area were kinda hard to come by, and this same exact CRF450L kept popping up over and over. I liked the way it looked, it was street legal, it seemed versatile, and honestly, I figured it'd be a good way to try something completely different from a sport bike. So of course, I went out, I test rode it, fell in love, and I bought it. What I thought was just another random motorcycle purchase ended up completely changing the direction of my riding life. This bike became my first dirt bike, my first supermoto, my first introduction to off-road riding, my introduction to the supermoto community, and ultimately the bike that reignited my passion for riding. Over the last 3 years, this machine has taken me on thousands of miles of adventures, survived countless modifications, introduced me to riders from all over the country, helped me build this channel, and taught me more about bikes than I could have ever imagined. But after 540 hours of hard riding, how has the CRF450L held up? What broke? What maintenance has it needed? What parts failed? How reliable has it been? And if I could go back and do it all over again, would I still buy a CRF450L? Well, after putting more hours on this bike than most owners ever will, I think I've finally got the answer. So let's take a look at what over 20,000 miles and 540 hours has done to my CRF450L. So I know you may see my bike and think it's some fancy garage queen, but believe me, I use this bike hard. I've done everything from street riding, supermoto riding, enduro riding, highway miles, wheelies, commuting, group rides, taking this bike all over the country. So we're going to kind of break down each one of these categories and go over its pros and cons when it comes to riding it in each one of these scenarios. So when it comes to actually street riding the bike straight out of the box, straight factory from Honda, there are going to be a few drawbacks, of course. When I originally picked up the bike, I did a little bit of mix of all sorts of riding. The stock wheels and tires it comes with aren't bad, but running the 21-inch front wheel with the knobby tires is obviously the biggest drawback when it comes to street riding. Now, if you're somebody that's going to be doing 50-50 riding, maybe you're commuting to work and then hitting some single track after work, this setup's fine and you can make do for sure. But if you're only going to be street riding the bike, the biggest drawback, of course, is the wheel and tire setup. If you do plan to only ride on the road, I highly recommend getting a proper supermoto wheel and tire setup because that'll greatly make your road riding experience 10 times better. Now, there's so much that goes into building a proper full-blown supermoto, and I'm not going to go over that in this video. I have a separate video for that, but a good set of wheel and tires will definitely make your road riding experience better. Now, one of the complaints I always see in the forums is the seat. Everybody always complains about the factory seat, and I do have to say, from factory, from Honda, the stock seat is very stiff, but that kind of goes for any dirt bike. I honestly really enjoy the stock seat, but I think it's because of how many hours I have on the bike. I can wore the seat in very well. Now, a lot of people do upgrade to the seat concept seat, which I did have for a short period of time, and yes, it's more comfortable, but I personally didn't like it. So I decided to stick with the stock seat. I just changed out my seat cover, and that greatly helped the comfortability. When it comes to the overall ergonomics of the bike and the seating position, this is one of the things that I think the CRF450L does great. I personally love the ergonomics and the seating position of this bike. Since I've got into the whole moto scene, I've had tons of different dirt bikes, and I personally have a brand new KTM 300 right now. And one of the bikes I always go back to is my CRF450 just because of how comfortable it really is. Just the overall ergonomics of the bike, the shifter location, the rear brake, the way you sit into the seat, the bar height. I just love everything about the seating position. Now, when it comes to actually road riding one of these bikes, you do have to realize at the end of the day, you're almost riding a dirt bike on the road. So you're gonna have to deal with the wind. You know, the bike, you don't have any wind protection, so it's gonna blow you around a little bit. But if you can deal with a little bit of wind and a little bit of vibration, the bike overall isn't very bad to ride on the street at all. And if you plan on doing any serious commuting where you have to jump on the highway for a period of time, it can definitely handle the highway riding, like I said. The only thing you got to worry about is the wind. Now, the factory gearing from Honda is a 13 tooth up front and a 50 tooth in the back. Now, if you jump on the highway with the factory wheel set and the factory gearing, you will notice a little drawback in top speed. You can fix this with proper gearing. Throwing a simple 14 tooth sprocket on the front will greatly help this bike out on the highway. I've personally messed around with the gearing a lot on this bike. A lot of guys run a 1348 or a 1344. And overall, you can tailor this bike to be a fairly decent commuter bike. Now, when it comes to doing some proper enduro riding on this bike, in my experience, it does very good. But there's also some drawbacks. You do have to realize if you're doing slow, technical, single track riding, this is a 450 at the end of the day. So you will have to be on and off the clutch a lot. You'll probably be in first gear a lot. I want to say that's really a drawback to the 450L or RL. That's more of just a 450 thing. Whether you're on a KTM 450 enduro bike or a CRF 450R, you're all going to have about the same problems when it comes to doing tight, technical single track on a 450. Where this bike really shines is wide open, high speed off-road riding. I mean, essentially what the bike was built for. Overall, in my experience, I've had a great experience with the 450L in all these scenarios. My personal CRF 450L is pretty much a full-time supermoto now. I don't really take it in the woods like I used to anymore. Now I just jump around town, jump on the highway, and honestly, I don't have a single complaint. It's been great, and when I did used to ride it in the woods, it also did fairly good. Now, this is a bike you can truly do anything with. I wouldn't necessarily say it's amazing at anything, but it's good at everything. Take it on the highway, you can take it on the moto track, you can take it on some single track, you can take it adventure riding, supermoto riding, and it's going to do everything you want it to do, but it's just not going to be the best at it. When it comes to the reliability of the 450L or RL, I think this is almost one of the biggest selling points of the bike. Out of all the bikes I've owned, I honestly think this is the only one that I'd be willing to take anywhere and not have a worry in the world. This bike has seriously never left me stranded once. I've taken this bike to multiple states, long road trips. I've done 4 or 5 hour long stretches of riding this bike, and it has never broken once or left me stranded. I've never had a single engine problem with this bike, a single electrical problem with this bike, no matter how wet it's got, no matter how aggressive I am with the pressure washer, and the bike's even running the stock fuel pump still after 540 hours. I've only ever had one problem with the fuel pump itself, and that ended up just being the fuel filter. At the time, like I said, I was fairly new to dirt bikes, so I didn't know that was something that had to be maintained, and I just had a clogged fuel filter. After I changed the fuel filter, the bike started right back up, and haven't had a problem since. When it comes to maintenance, I'm a strong believer in if you really take care of the bike, it will last you a long time. So when it comes to changing the oil, you'll see a lot of guys on the forums or even in the manual, it'll say every 5,000 miles, every 3,000 miles. I changed it every 2,500 miles. I've personally changed my oil every 20 to 25 hours, depending on how I'm riding the bike. which yes, is pretty frequent, even more frequent than the factory manual states, but I think that's one of the reasons the bike is as healthy as it is today. And the total cost to do an oil change on these bikes is extremely low. We're talking $10 to $12 for an oil filter. The bike only takes 1.12 quarts of oil, so I just buy a big 5-gallon jug of oil, and we're probably roughly looking at $20 to $25 an oil change for this bike, which isn't bad at all. When it comes to the air filter on this bike, it is a little bit more inconvenient when you compare it to something like the KTMs. On the Honda, you actually have to take the seat off to get to the air box, but I think that's one of the reasons that it keeps the air filter so clean. One of the first things I did to the bike around 900 miles was remove the air box lid to give the bike a little bit extra airflow. And even after I did that, the air filter still very frequently gets dirty. Other than that, guys, I just keep the bike really greased and lubed up. I lube my chain, I grease my wheel bearings, I check my coolant and bleed my brakes every once in a while. The maintenance on this bike has been extremely simple and straightforward. So everybody that's worried about high dirt bike maintenance, it's really not that bad on the CRF450L. And I definitely wouldn't let that stray you away from getting this bike. So let's actually get into some juicy stuff now. What wore out and what broke after 20,000 miles and 540 hours on the bike? Of course, you're gonna have your normal wear items like tires, brake pads, rotors. The first thing on this bike I would absolutely change out is the factory chain and sprockets. The factory sprockets come with a rubber anti-vibration ring on them, as well as the stock chain is very cheap and kind of known to break. So I swapped mine out for a nice set of Renthal sprockets. And if you didn't know, this bike can pretty much only fit one chain, and that is the DID EVRT chain. As for all the bearings on the bike, guys, of course you're gonna have to change a wheel bearing here and there. But actually, last winter, I finally decided to go ahead and change every single chassis bearing on the bike. I did the swing arm bearings, the linkage bearings, the steering stem bearing, and I changed all those roughly at 450 hours. And I only changed them because I wanted to freshen up the bike. But I was actually very surprised whenever I pulled every single bearing out, and they almost looked brand new and spun perfectly fine. Even the factory Showa suspension kind of blew my mind. I know Honda doesn't make the Showa suspension, but the factory fork seals and everything else in the suspension were fine up until about 250 hours. At that point, I finally decided to go ahead and get my suspension built for my height and weight, but the factory suspension does its job just fine. When it comes to actually riding the bike in the woods or enduro riding, the suspension was plush and fairly nice. If you do plan to ride the bike as a supermoto or street ride it, that's kind of the downfall of the suspension. Obviously, the suspension was designed for enduro riding, so it's a little bit soft when it comes to riding it as a supermoto. But if you guys are coming from dirt bikes or you've been around dirt bikes for a long time, I'm sure you already plan on getting the suspension built because that's a fairly common thing in the dirt bike world. So how's the engine holding up after 500 hours? Well, honestly, the power feels the same. The bike still pulls extremely hard. The compression feels fine. It starts up every single time, no matter how cold or how hot it is. And currently my bike only has one small oil leak that just started recently, and it's just the shifter seal. And somehow, surprisingly, after 500 hours, the bike's still running the factory clutch, which I think this year I'm finally going to go ahead and change the clutch out just for something better like a Hinson clutch. But the factory clutch has lasted a ton of abuse. Even the valves. I don't know what Honda did with the valves. I know they're titanium valves, but they literally have never gone out of spec. I used to check the valves pretty frequently up until about 250, 300 hours. And after that, I check them maybe once a year. And like I said, they've never gone out of spec. And that's crazy considering I have cruised on the highway on this bike, ringing it out pretty decently. Now, the only downfall about this bike is it does require an initial investment of buying a few parts to actually get the bike running properly when it's brand new. The factory ECU tune and factory exhaust and all the emissions equipment that Honda had to put on the bike to comply with all the US and European regulations make the bike kind of sluggish and tend to flame out a lot. So even if you're a guy that likes to keep his bikes fairly stock, I would highly recommend getting a nice ECU for the bike. I decided to go with the Vortex ECU and also get a nice exhaust for the bike, like a full Yoshimura or FMF or even the Graves exhaust. At about 900 miles, I threw a Vortex ECU, I did a full Yoshimura exhaust, and I also did a full emissions delete kit. Now from factory, like I said, because of the regulations, Honda installed a charcoal canister, there's a thermostat on the bike, they rerouted the valve cover vent into the airbox. There's a lot of extra junk on the bike. So I highly recommend doing the emissions delete, the ECU, and a full exhaust. You'll fully open the bike up and it runs so much better and healthier. The only other complaint I really had about this bike, and this really only applied to enduro riding, it is a heavy bike. You have to realize Honda did put a lot of extras on this bike when it came to all the emissions equipment, the extended subframe, all the lighting. Surprisingly, that stuff does add a lot of weight, and you feel the weight the most whenever you're doing the slow technical stuff. So I went ahead and deleted as much weight as I possibly could. I did a full CRF450R plastic swap, got rid of all the factory lighting, did a full low profile lighting kit, cut down the rear subframe to the proper CRF450R length, got rid of all the emissions equipment, the factory exhaust, and that alone took so much weight off the bike, and it definitely feels more comparable to say a proper 450 bike or 450 enduro bike. When it comes to the fuel range on this bike, I was actually really surprised by this. You would generally think a MX style dirt bike wouldn't get great fuel range, but on the factory tank I could get anywhere from 80 to 110 miles depending on how I rode it. The fuel range was so good I actually went to a smaller tank. I went to a factory CRF450R tank, which is just a little bit over a gallon, and I'm still getting over 60 miles of range. Now this all comes down to the type of riding you guys are doing. If you're doing long enduro rides or desert rides or doing long highway cruises, you might want to get a bigger tank, something like the IMS 3-gallon tank, which I previously ran on my bike for a while. I just ended up getting rid of it because I didn't like the extra weight that it added to the front of the bike. So would I buy this bike again? That's a really hard question to answer, because sometimes when I ride with my buddies that are on KTM 500s or WR450s or some of the other competitors for this bike, I'm almost jealous just because of the raw performance of those bikes. If you look at a bike like the KTM 500, it makes more power and it's lighter. But I also look around and see some of the experiences they've had with those bikes. The random motor issues, the random electrical problems. Now I know that's not every single KTM or Yamaha or Beta that would have those type of problems. But something I always look back on is, I've never had any of those problems. I've always been able to just jump on my bike and go ride. I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to the bike you get. You could get a good Honda CRF450L or you could get a bad Honda. You could get a good KTM or a bad KTM. I've seen those KTM 500s run 700-800 hours with no problems in the forums. So I think if I look back, I'm actually happy that I did buy the bike that I did. Overall, the Honda CRF450L and RL platform is just an extremely reliable tank of a bike. Yeah, it might be a little heavy, it might not make the best power, it might not be the best at anything, but it's kind of good at everything. So after 500 hours and 20,000 miles, I can confidently say I'd probably buy this bike again. I think the overall reliability of this bike just makes up for the extra weight and the little less amount of power, because having a bike I can jump on and ride every day without a problem is more important to me sometimes than having the best bike. If you guys are in the market to get one of these bikes, I hope this video helped you choose. And if you guys have any questions about anything about this bike, just drop a comment down below and I will get back to you guys.